He was left to die in the blazing sun by the one man meant to protect him. But the wilderness had other plans, and a stranger with scars of his own wasn't about to walk away from the boy no one wanted. The desert don't forgive. It don't forget either. When the sun is at its peak and the sand hisses like a snake, most men ride faster and pray harder. But no one prayed for the boy that day. He was left slumped against a jutting rock, a shadow barely clinging to his small frame. His clothes were dust-caked, lips cracked, and one leg bent beneath him like it no longer belonged to his body. His eyes didn't blink at the buzzards overhead. He didn't call out. He couldn't. His name was Daniel. No more than 11, the boy had the kind of quiet eyes that held stories, or maybe secrets, maybe pain. Either way, he sat there, paralyzed from the waist down, the evidence of a fall or a beating, hidden beneath layers of dried blood and torn cloth. The man who had left him there wasn't a stranger. He wasn't a bandit or outlaw. He was Daniel's own father. Clayton Ward rode away slow, not out of guilt, but calculation. He looked back once, expression hidden beneath the brim of his dusty black hat. Then he kicked up the pace and vanished into the sandstone dust, as if the boy he birthed had never existed at all. But the desert wasn't silent that day, not entirely. Miles away, deep in the crooked ribs of the rocky hills where pines bent beneath the weight of time and wind, a mountain man was descending. He was known to some, feared by others, and avoided by all who could help it. He lived alone, spoke little, answered to the name Thorn. Thorn wasn't his birth name. No one knew what that was anymore. Scars crossed his knuckles and jaw, and his voice was low enough to make coyotes turn tail. Most folks figured he was too broken to bother with. But the truth was, Thorn had lost something once, someone, and the silence was the only thing that kept him from remembering. He'd come down from the hills that day to trade pelts and tobacco root in a small town north of the basin. He'd done the trip a dozen times. Nothing changed except the dust and the faces at the general store. But on the ride down, something pulled him west. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe it was something deeper. But his horse, Hob, kept glancing that direction like it felt the same strange call. By mid-afternoon, the sun burned red across the sky, and the mountains stretched long shadows east. That's when Thorn saw something that made his hand tighten on the reins. A figure slumped against a rock, barely taller than the sagebrush around it. He didn't speak as he approached, just dismounted and crouched beside the boy, pressing 2 fingers to the child's neck. A pulse faint but still there. Daniel stirred barely but didn't speak. His lips moved, dry and cracked like the land around him, but no sound came. His shirt had been ripped, the buttons torn in haste. His right leg twisted at an unnatural angle, and flies gathered around an open gash on his side. Thorn didn't ask questions. He didn't need answers yet. He lifted the boy gently, cradling him like something sacred, and laid him across Hob's saddle. The child weighed less than a full deer carcass, too light, too still. By the time they reached Thorn's cabin, the moon had climbed and stars stitched the sky. The mountain air was cooler, cleaner, the kind that healed if you gave it time. Thorn's home was a sturdy log structure, set deep in the pines where no wagon dared go. There was no road, no path, only memory. Inside, he laid the boy on a thick bed of wool and pine needle padding near the fire. He worked by lantern light, washing the wounds and setting the broken leg with a care that belied his size. Thorn wasn't a doctor, but he'd seen enough injuries in the wild to know what death looked like. And this boy was teetering. For 2 days, Daniel hovered between waking and dreams. He cried out once in the night, a single word, "Pa." Thorn didn't speak. just listened. And when the boy finally opened his eyes on the third day, blinking slowly at the timbered ceiling, he found the mountain man sitting nearby, whittling a piece of ashwood down to a smooth curl. "You're safe now," Thorn said, voice like gravel underfoot. The boy looked down, tried to move his legs but couldn't. Tears came quick, silent, no sobbing, just wet trails across his cheeks. Thorn didn't stop him, didn't comfort with lies. Instead he rose, fetched a ladle of warm broth and sat beside the child. "What's your name?" he asked after a moment. "Daniel," came the hoarse reply. Thorn nodded. "You remember how you got out there?" Daniel's jaw twitched, then he whispered, "Pa didn't want me no more." And just like that, Thorn knew. Not every injury came from a fall. Some wounds were handed down by blood, by betrayal too deep for words. Over the next week, Thorn learned pieces. How Clayton Ward had once been a proud rancher, brutal, rich, and known for hiring men to do his dirty work. How Daniel had taken a fall from a horse weeks ago and hadn't walked since. How the doctors told Clayton there was no fixing it, no hope, and how that was when the beating started, when Clayton stopped calling him son and started calling him burden. And one day they rode out alone, just the two of them. Daniel thought maybe they were going to town. Maybe Pa was taking him to see a better doctor. But they never reached town. And the boy was never meant to return. Thorn said little, but he watched the boy, helped him eat, turned him in his sleep. And one night when the wind howled like a mother mourning her loss, Daniel asked, "Why'd you help me?" The mountain man stared at the fire for a long time. "Because someone once didn't." That was all he said, but the look in his eyes was enough. Daniel began to heal, not walk, not yet, but his spirit steadied. He smiled once when Thorn tripped over a pile of firewood and muttered something that made the pine trees blush. He laughed again when a chipmunk stole a biscuit right off the windowsill and Thorn chased it for half a mile. But peace doesn't last long in places where blood runs unatoned. Word came through a trapper's whisper that Clayton Ward had returned to town alone and told folks his son had died in a snakebite accident. Buried him in the desert, he said, and the sheriff believed him. But not everyone did. A widow named Ruth, a woman who once tended Daniel when he was small, asked too many questions. Said she didn't trust the way Clayton smiled when he talked of grief. Said she knew what cruelty looked like when it wore a man's hat and kept a pistol close to the dinner table. And when word reached her that a mountain man had come down from the ridge the same day Daniel went missing, she got to thinking. She started asking around. And it wasn't long before her questions brought trouble to Thorn's cabin door. Because Clayton wasn't done. He knew what he'd done, and more than that, he feared someone might be alive to tell the truth. And if there was one thing a man like him couldn't stand, it was truth in the mouth of a crippled child. The knock came just after dawn. 3 sharp raps like a judge calling silence in a courtroom. Thorn paused mid-step, spoon still in hand, the smell of cornmeal and rabbit broth rising from the pot on the fire. He knew that knock. It wasn't made by someone lost or friendly. It was made by someone confident, someone who believed they had the right to intrude. Daniel lay still in the cot by the hearth, eyes wide, fingers gripping the quilt Thorn had stitched from old flannel shirts. He said nothing, but the tension in his jaw told Thorn everything. The boy was remembering something, maybe the weight of his father's hand, or the sting of the last goodbye that wasn't one. Thorn set the spoon down quietly and crossed the room. He didn't rush. He never did. He reached for the rifle by the door but didn't lift it yet. Instead, he pulled the handle slow and opened the door halfway, letting the morning breeze slip in. Two men stood outside. One was a stranger, young, wiry, with a twitch in his left hand and a coat too clean for this deep in the woods. The other, though older, looked sharper than a Bowie knife. Marshal Everett Cray, a lawman from the Southern Valley who served letters more often than he drew guns, but made sure each word he wrote carried a weight heavier than lead. "Morning," Cray said evenly, removing his hat with respect. His eyes, a washed-out gray, didn't blink. "I'm looking for a man named Thorne. Got reason to believe he may have picked up a boy that belongs to someone else." Thorne didn't step back. "He don't belong to anyone." Cray raised a brow. "That's so." "He was left to die," Thorne said. His voice was low and even. "I found him, fed him, took care of him. If you're here to take him back to the man who did that, you best turn around now." The younger man beside Cray cleared his throat. "The boy's father, Clayton Ward, says it was an accident, that he buried the boy with his own hands after a snake bit him. Says he don't know how anyone could have seen the body, let alone rescued it." Thorne's hand flexed at his side, near the rifle but not on it. "Clayton Ward's a liar," came a voice from behind him. Daniel, thin and hoarse but steady. Thorne stepped aside just enough for the lawman to see the boy sitting up in the cot. His hair was messy, face pale but defiant. His hands trembled as he pushed himself higher. "You want to know what happened," Daniel said. "He left me, told me I was dead to him, said I'd make better food for buzzards than used to him on a ranch, and then he rode off." Cray didn't move for a long time. Then he nodded slowly. "You willing to say all that in front of a judge?" Daniel swallowed. His eyes flicked to Thorne, then back to the marshal. "I am." Cray sighed and glanced toward the trees. "That'll stir things up, son. You sure?" Daniel nodded. "I ain't scared of him no more." Cray scratched his chin. "You might be brave, but you ain't safe yet." The lawman left without trouble, promised to return with proper court papers and maybe a wagon to bring the boy into town. But once he was gone, Thorne didn't relax. Neither did Daniel. "Cray's not the worry," Thorne muttered as he bolted the door. "It's Clayton. He'll hear about that meeting and he won't wait for courts." Sure enough, word traveled faster than truth ever could. That night Thorne caught the glint of a spyglass up in the trees. A day later, a string of rabbit snares were tripped with no kill. Then 2 nights after that, someone left a bullet casing on the cabin porch. No note, no threat, just that small brass reminder, "We know where you are." Daniel didn't cry. He didn't even flinch when Thorne showed him the casing. "I ain't going back," he said, "even if he comes himself." And come he did. It was just past midnight when the dogs began to bark. Thorne had 2 mutts, both rescued, both meaner than hunger, and they never howled without cause. Thorne was already dressed, rifle in hand, when the first rock shattered the front window. "Come out, you coward," a voice bellowed from beyond the tree line. "Give me what's mine." Thorne pushed Daniel's cot deeper into the corner, behind the woodpile and barrels. "Don't speak unless I tell you," he warned. "And don't show yourself no matter what." The boy nodded. Thorne moved like smoke through the shadows, slipping out the back entrance and around the side of the cabin. The moon was low, thick clouds crawling like snakes across its face. The trees rustled and somewhere an owl screamed. But there was another sound, heavier. Boots crunching dried needles. A man walking slow, trying to listen for movement. Thorne waited behind the shed. He saw the figure approach, wide hat, tall frame, gun drawn. Clayton. "You can't keep him," Clayton called out. "You think you're a savior, huh? That boy's nothing but a husk. He don't eat right, can't work, ain't no use to no one but the crows." Thorne stepped into the moonlight. "He's more of a man than you'll ever be," he said. Clayton turned and raised the gun, but he was too slow. Thorne shot the weapon from his hand with one crack. The pistol flew into the dark. Clayton screamed, grabbing his wrist. "You shoot me and you'll hang for it." "I didn't shoot you," Thorne said, stepping closer. "I spared you." He shoved the man backward until Clayton stumbled into a tree. "You left a boy to die. That's not a crime I can forgive, but he can, and maybe that matters more." Clayton sneered. "He's my blood." Thorne's eyes narrowed. "Then maybe you ought to start acting like it." Cray arrived at dawn with a judge's note and a town doctor. Daniel was loaded onto a makeshift wagon while the sheriff escorted Clayton in cuffs, muttering about how he'd sue the county for defamation. But no one listened, not even the judge. The trial was short. Daniel spoke clearly, bravely. He didn't cry on the stand, not even when the defense tried to twist his words. The town had heard whispers of what Clayton was, but seeing the boy in a chair, legs unmoving, voice strong, that was different. That was truth. When the verdict came down, guilty of abandonment, intent to kill, and abuse of a dependent, Clayton didn't even blink. But as he was dragged from the courtroom, he turned to Daniel one last time. "You should have died." Daniel lifted his chin. "And you should have loved me." The whole room went still. After the trial, Ruth approached Thorne outside. She wore a green shawl and had tears in her eyes. "You saved that boy," she whispered. "Brought him back when the world gave up." Thorne didn't answer right away. He just looked over to where Daniel sat in the sun, smiling for the first time since Thorne had known him. "He saved himself," Thorne finally said. "I just gave him a place to do it." But Daniel wasn't done yet. Because not long after the dust settled, Cray rode out to Thorne's cabin again. Not to warn, not to question, but to ask. "You ever thought of taking him in, legal-like?" Thorne looked up from splitting logs. "You mean adopt him?" Cray nodded. "He won't be a ward of the court for long. He needs a name, a home." Thorne stared into the trees, the axe heavy in his hands. "I'll need time," he said. But the next morning, Daniel was already packing. "I ain't leaving," he told Thorne. "You can say no, but I'm staying." Thorne didn't argue. That night under the stars, the mountain man signed the papers. Winter came fast that year. Snow blanketed the ridge by early October, and the path into town turned into a treacherous stretch of ice and brittle roots. The mountains didn't make room for the unsteady, and those who didn't know how to read the wind often paid in blood. But even with the cold settling into his bones, Thorne moved through the snow as if it had grown familiar, like an old wound that stopped hurting, not because it healed, but because it had simply become part of him. Daniel sat near the fire inside the cabin, a book balanced across his knees. It was a gift from Ruth, an old dime novel with frayed pages and a hero who sounded more like a poet than a cowboy. He'd read it so many times he could quote it by heart, but he liked the way the words made the cabin feel bigger. Thorne entered with a gust of wind, carrying a heavy sack over his shoulder and a silence in his eyes. "You get the mail?" Daniel asked, folding the book shut. Thorne nodded and tossed a bundle onto the table. Among the letters and folded catalogs was one thin envelope that bore the courthouse seal. Daniel watched as Thorne's hand paused over it, but he didn't open it right away. Instead, he poured a measure of coffee, sat down slowly, and stared into the flames. Daniel knew better than to push. Time had taught him that Thorne only spoke when he had something real to say. It wasn't about avoiding emotion. It was about making sure every word mattered. After a long minute, Thorne slid the envelope across the table. "Judge signed it," he said simply. Daniel reached for it with trembling fingers, then opened it slowly, reading each line twice before he dared to speak. "I'm yours," he whispered, "by law." Thorne looked up. "You always were. Paper just caught up to truth." Daniel tried to say more, but the lump in his throat held back the words. He nodded instead, eyes shining, and when Thorne reached over to clasp his shoulder, it was the first time in weeks that Daniel didn't feel like a boy abandoned. He felt like a son. For a time, peace settled over them like snowfall, soft, cold, quiet. Thorne taught Daniel how to gut trout with one hand and use a knife without cutting what couldn't grow back. Daniel, in turn, showed Thorne how to laugh again. He could still barely feel his legs, and though the doctor in town said there might be hope if they traveled to the city, Daniel never asked for it. He'd already learned that a broken body didn't mean a broken soul. But peace has a way of souring when the past doesn't stay buried. It started with a letter, then two, then a third with no return address. Each one carried the same message, scrawled in shaky script. "You think this is over. The mountain don't forgive. I want what's mine." Thorne burned the first one, buried the second. But when the third arrived wrapped around a dried rattlesnake skin, he knew it wasn't a bluff. "He's out," Thorne told Ruth the next time he rode to town. "Clayton's out of prison, and he's watching." Ruth's face paled beneath her bonnet. The judge swore he'd serve at least 5 years. That was 3 months ago. "Pardon?" "No, released on account of age and poor health. Doctor signed a paper saying he wouldn't survive the winter behind bars." Ruth gripped the edge of the table. "So they let him out to die in comfort, but he's not dying, is he?" "No," Thorne said, "he's hunting." Ruth insisted they move closer to town. She even offered them the spare room behind the bakery, said she'd convert it for Daniel and leave Thorne the old root cellar to work in. But Daniel refused. "If I run now," he said, "he wins." Thorne didn't argue, though deep down he'd already started making preparations. Reinforcing windows, trapping the ridge trail, digging escape tunnels under the snow-packed floorboards, old minor tricks he hadn't used in years. But none of it prepared them for the knock. It came 3 nights later. Not a knock, really, more like a thump, dull, wet, rhythmic. Thorne rose from his cot and took the rifle without a word. Daniel sat up, heart thudding, hands clenched around the wool blanket. Thorne didn't open the door. He peered through the cracks in the shutter. Outside, something lay on the porch. He opened the door a crack, rifle ready. The cold bit into him and he squinted into the shadows. It was a dog, Thorne's old hound Rufus, dead, neck snapped. Around the collar was a scrap of canvas, a single word stitched crudely with pine tar. "Traitor." That was when Thorne knew this wasn't just about reclaiming a boy. It was revenge. Not the kind served by law or in daylight, but the slow-burning kind that ate through flesh and bone like rust. "We can't stay here," he said, bolting the door, not with him watching. Daniel didn't argue. The next morning, Thorne pulled the sled from the shed and began packing supplies: jerky, cornmeal, 2 tin pots, and enough fire starter to last a week. He wrapped Daniel in furs, tucked him into the sled, and hitched it to his own shoulders. The boy didn't weigh much. They didn't head for town. They headed higher, up past the timberline, into the part of the mountains where the wind didn't speak English, and the trees grew sideways from sheer stubbornness. There was a place Thorn knew, an old trapper's cave he'd once used after a blizzard trapped him for a week. It was dry, hidden, and stocked with enough goods to last a stretch. It wouldn't keep them safe forever, but it might buy time. 2 days they climbed. The snow grew deeper, the sky darker. Daniel didn't complain once. But Clayton was clever. On the third night, just as Thorn finished setting the snare lines, a shot rang out through the trees. Not aimed, just a warning. The echo lasted longer than the threat. Daniel froze in the cave's mouth. He found us. Thorn didn't deny it. They took turns keeping watch. Thorn sat by the fire, eyes never closing, and Daniel practiced loading the rifle with hands that still shook but no longer trembled with fear. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was preparing. And then just before dawn, Clayton came. He didn't charge. He waited, camped just below the cave's ridge, close enough to keep pressure, far enough to avoid a clean shot. Thorn counted 3 men, Clayton and 2 others, mercenaries maybe, hired hands with more guns than principals. "Why won't he quit?" Daniel whispered. "Because you stood up," Thorn said. "Because truth shames a man more than prison ever could." Thorn waited until nightfall. Then he moved like he'd done in his younger days, silent, fast, one with the dark. He disabled the mercenaries first, cutting their packs and stealing their ammo while they slept. He didn't kill them, just left them confused, cold, and without a plan. Then it was just Clayton. Thorn returned to the cave. "It's him now," he said, "just him." Daniel reached for the rifle. "No," Thorn said. "He wants you to fight. He wants a reason to call you what he already believes. We're not giving him that." Instead, Thorn walked down the path into the clearing, where Clayton sat by the fire, chewing jerky like it was leather. "I should kill you," Clayton muttered without looking up. "You already tried," Thorn replied. Clayton laughed. "You're soft. I should have known you'd despoil him. That boy's cursed." "No," Thorn said, "he's forgiven." Clayton's eyes turned to fire. "You think that means something?" "I think it means everything." Clayton rose to his feet, shaking with rage. Thorn didn't raise his hands. He didn't reach for the knife at his hip. He just looked the man in the eye and said the one thing Clayton couldn't stand. "He doesn't need you anymore." Clayton swung. Thorn didn't move. The punch landed, hard and bitter, but when Thorn stayed standing, Clayton froze. "You're not worth hate," Thorn said, "and you're not worth fear." Then from behind a tree came the sound of footsteps. Marshal Cray. He had ridden through the snow alone, tracking Clayton's men through the drifts. It was Ruth who'd told him, said she'd had a feeling, said she'd woken with a chill she couldn't shake. Cray arrested Clayton on the spot, this time not for abandonment or cruelty, but for attempted murder, stalking, and trespassing across state lines. "I'll see to it he doesn't breathe free air again," Cray promised. "But you," he looked to Thorn, then Daniel, "you two best not hide anymore." Back in town, the story spread like fire through dry grass. How the mountain man had taken in a paralyzed boy, stood up to a murderer, and protected what wasn't blood, but was something stronger. Family. Word moved like thunder through the valley, not in whispers this time, but spoken loud over supper tables, in the dusty corners of the saloon, across the church pews, and even at the edge of the schoolyard where boys dared each other to spit the farthest. The tale wasn't just about danger or grit. It was about the kind of redemption no one in town had expected. Folks remembered the boy left to die, and now they were seeing him again, not a ghost, but flesh and breath, wrapped in furs beside the man who refused to let him disappear. Marshal Cray had escorted Clayton out in irons, but Thorne and Daniel didn't ride back into town in triumph. They walked, quiet, intent. When they passed the general store, heads turned. Children stepped out of the way with wide eyes. A few women pressed their hands to their mouths, remembering the day Ruth had first returned with that boy in her wagon, half dead and dried by sun. And now here he was again, sitting upright, his eyes clearer than theirs, holding tight to the reins of the sled as if he were the one guiding it. Daniel saw the faces. He didn't speak, didn't wave, just stared straight ahead. Ruth stood on the boardwalk, apron still dusted with flour, her hands shaking around a cup of coffee gone cold. When Thorne nodded, she nodded back, then turned and went inside without a word. It was the town's way of saying what they wouldn't admit out loud. They were sorry, but not brave enough to say so. At the cabin, the fire had gone out. Snow blanketed the roof like time erasing a story too painful to remember. Thorne didn't say anything as he dug out the drift from the front door, then lifted Daniel in his arms, carrying him over the threshold like a vow renewed. They didn't talk much that first night. Thorne said about boiling water, warming stew, laying fresh pelts near the hearth. Daniel sat in silence, his fingers curled around the spine of his book, unmoving. "Say what you're thinking," Thorne said finally, stirring the pot. "I shouldn't have come back," Daniel whispered. Thorne turned. "What?" "I was dead out there. He meant for me to die. You could have gone on without me, lived safe, quiet. He wouldn't have come for you if it wasn't for me." Thorne knelt before him, his eyes hard and dry. "That's not how I live. That's not how I was made." Daniel didn't answer. He blinked slowly, the way someone does when they're trying to hold in something heavy. "You ever wonder why he hated me so much?" the boy asked. Thorne didn't respond. "He blamed me for her dying," Daniel continued. "Mama, she went into labor too soon. Blood wouldn't stop. He said I ruined her, said I should have died instead." Thorne swallowed hard, then sat back, shoulders tense beneath his coat. "I remember it," Daniel said. "Not the day, but the sound, his voice when he screamed. I was little, maybe 5. He threw the lamp at the wall and told me I owed him life for the one I stole." "You don't owe him anything," Thorne said. "What happened wasn't your fault." "Doesn't matter," Daniel whispered. "I believed him. I still do sometimes." Thorne reached forward, slow and deliberate, and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "That belief dies now, tonight, in this room." Daniel looked at him, and for the first time since the desert, he nodded. They stayed quiet after that, not from distance, but from understanding. In the weeks that followed, town life kept on. Children played, women stitched, men hunted elk in the high pass, but no one forgot what happened. No one forgot the man who'd been left for dead and the mountain that gave him back. Then one afternoon, as the sun spilled gold over the hills, an envelope arrived. Postmarked Denver, addressed to Daniel Harrow. He opened it with careful hands. Inside, a letter on thick stationery and a folded certificate from the university hospital. It read, "Dear Mr. Harrow, you have reviewed your case, including the physician's notes sent from name of local doctor. Based on your condition and response to limited mobility therapies, We believe you are a strong candidate for our spinal neural stimulation program. This treatment has shown significant improvement in young patients with lower limb paralysis. We'd be honored to evaluate you further at our Denver campus. Travel arrangements and costs will be covered by the state's Welfare Rehabilitation Fund upon approval. Please contact us at your earliest convenience. Daniel stared at the paper for a long time. Then slowly he handed it to Thorne. "What do you think?" he asked. Thorne read it through twice, then folded it back neatly and handed it back. "I think it's your choice. What if it doesn't work? Then we try again. What if it hurts? It might. What if I come back and I'm still like this?" Thorne looked him square in the eye. "You'll still be mine." Daniel blinked fast and nodded. The townspeople came together like they hadn't in years. Ruth organized the bake sale. Marshall Cray wrote to the governor's office for expedited transport papers. The blacksmith donated his cart, reinforced with new wheels and thick axles. And that quiet preacher, who hadn't spoken to Thorne since the blizzard of '81, stood up in church and asked for prayer. They left at sunrise. Ruth hugged Daniel for a long time, whispering something into his hair he never repeated. Thorne helped him into the coach, tucked blankets around him, then climbed up front beside the driver. It was a 3-day ride. Daniel asked 100 questions, most of them about cities and trains and what Denver smelled like. Thorne didn't know most of the answers, but he pretended he did. It kept the boy calm. When they arrived, the hospital stood like a stone fortress, tall, cold, clean. Inside, they were greeted by white-coated men and nurses who smiled like they didn't know fear. Daniel was taken for tests, X-rays, probes, electric nerve response monitors. Thorne waited outside each time, fingers twitching. At the end of the week, a doctor pulled them aside. "It's possible," he said. "Not guaranteed, but possible." Daniel asked, "What's it feel like if it works?" The doctor smiled gently, like coming home to a part of yourself you thought had died. Thorne stayed the full month, sleeping in the chair beside Daniel's cot, walking the halls when sleep wouldn't come. Some nights he sat on the roof, watching the smoke curl from chimneys and wondering what kind of man he was becoming. Because for the first time in his life someone needed him, not for protection, not for work, but just because he stayed. On the 32nd day, Daniel moved his toe. Just once. Barely. But he did. He cried, not loud, not childlike, just enough for Thorne to see. And when he moved it again the next morning, they both understood. Something had changed. Recovery took months. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden standing, no miraculous leap from bed. But bit by bit, Daniel reclaimed the pieces of himself that Clayton had tried to bury. A finger twitch, a muscle spasm, a shiver in the ankle. Every inch fought for like a battle no one else could see. The doctors praised his progress, said he had willpower stronger than steel, but Daniel knew it wasn't just him. It was Thorne, the man who stayed, the man who carried him when his own blood had walked away. When they returned to town, it was spring. Birds sang. The river had thawed. Flowers pressed through the earth like they'd been waiting. Thorne lifted Daniel down from the cart. But Daniel didn't need to be carried anymore. He braced against the crutch, took a slow, trembling step toward the porch and smiled. Ruth gasped. Then the whole street went silent. No one said a word as the boy crossed the boardwalk, step by shaking step, until he reached the old wooden bench outside the bakery and sat, breathing hard. It wasn't much, but it was his. And in that quiet moment, the town realized something they'd forgotten. Miracles don't always come loud. Sometimes they arrive like footsteps, slow, unsure, stubborn. But they arrive. Spring gave way to summer, and with each passing week, Daniel's legs inched forward, slower than a stream in drought but sure as sunrise. The boy who'd once been left for dead in the canyon shadows now walked with a limp and a cane, and a gaze stronger than most men's pride. Townsfolk whispered his name with reverence now, not pity. But it wasn't just Daniel who'd changed. Thorn had softened, not in stature. He still walked broad-shouldered with that unbothered gait, but in his eyes, in the way he spoke, in how often he listened. The mountain had weathered him for decades, but Daniel had given him something even the pines couldn't: reason. Most days they worked side by side in the field behind the cabin. Thorn handled the fencing and the axe work. Daniel, seated on a tall stool Ruth had brought over, cleaned tack, whittled stakes, and mapped out a little chicken run they were building from salvaged boards. Their conversations weren't long, but they were honest, always circling back to the same unspoken truth. Neither of them expected this kind of life, but both knew better than to turn it away. Then one night just before the harvest moon, someone knocked on their door. Not gently, not the curious knock of a neighbor bringing stew or supplies. This was hard, purposeful, 3 times, a pause, then 2 more. Thorn opened the door slowly, rifle leaned just within reach. It was the sheriff. But not Cray. This man wore a badge, but it gleamed too much. His boots were polished, his hat too clean, and his face sharp, waxy, with the kind of eyes that didn't blink when they should have. He smiled like a man who never meant it. "Evenin', Mr. Thorn, Mr. Harrow." Daniel stiffened in his chair. "I'm Marshal Breckley, sent up from Fort Anders, interim overseer for this district. Heard some noise about a boy returned from the dead and a man who took justice into his own hands." Thorn said nothing, just studied him. "I'm here," Breckley continued, "to clean up some loose ends. That rancher Clayton Harrow, he's making noise in his cell, claims there's more to this story than folks let on. He says he's got friends, business partners, contracts, and he's naming names." "He's a liar," Daniel said coldly. Breckley looked at him. "Might be, but I've learned that liars are only dangerous when people stop paying attention." "Why are you really here?" Thorn asked. Breckley didn't answer. He just reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document. "Summons," he said. "You're both requested to appear in front of the Territorial Council 2 weeks from today. They want to hear the story straight from the source. Boy says he was abandoned. Father says he was robbed. Council wants the truth, and they want it sworn." He placed the paper on the table, tipped his hat, and turned to leave. At the door he paused. "Oh, one more thing. There's a bounty hunter coming through. Claims to be a cousin of the Harrow family. Wants custody of the boy if the father's testimony checks out. Says kinship beats charity." Thorn's jaw tightened. "The boy's not up for claim." "We'll see," Breckley said. "Law's got long arms, and it don't always favor who it should." He left without another word. The silence that followed was thick. Daniel stared at the summons. What if they believe him? What if they take me back? Thorn stepped forward and tore the paper in half. "They won't." Daniel swallowed. "But if they do, I'm not going back there. I won't let them put me in another bed I can't leave." Thorn rested a hand on his shoulder. "They'll have to go through me." 2 days later, another visitor came. This time it was Ruth, but she wasn't alone. She brought an old man with her, stooped, wrapped in a brown duster, and clutching a cane that looked like it had seen every state west of the Mississippi. "This," she said, "is Ephraim Calloway, judge, retired, friend of my father's." Thorne raised a brow. "You brought us a judge." "I brought you a witness," Ruth corrected. "One who knows what happens when towns forget how to protect their own." Calloway tipped his hat. "Ruth told me the story, I believe her, but I need to hear it from you both." They sat on the porch, dusk settling in like a blanket of secrets. Daniel told the tale first, halting at times but never looking away. He described the desert, the screams, the silence, the loneliness. Then Thorne spoke about the journey back, the healing, the way Daniel's spirit fought when his body couldn't. When they finished, the old man nodded. "You've done everything the law should have done for you. If it fails now, it's not because of what you lacked, it's because of what it's become." He handed them a second document, this one notarized, with a seal that shimmered under the lantern light. "Affidavit of guardianship," he said. "I signed it. Ruth witnessed it. We'll deliver it to the council ourselves. Let them try to argue with truth inked on paper." Thorne held the paper like it might crumble. "Why are you helping us?" Calloway looked at Daniel. "Because I once had a son, and I failed him." He didn't say more. The days before the hearing passed too fast. Daniel practiced his walking each morning, sometimes pushing past the pain, sometimes collapsing into the dirt. Thorne watched without interfering, only stepping in when the boy's knees buckled completely. There were no lectures, no soft words, only a hand on the back and a nod that said, "Get up, I'm here." On the morning of the summons, they arrived in town before the church bell rang. The courthouse wasn't big, just a brick structure tucked between the millinery and the grain store, but it felt like a mountain that morning. Inside it was already packed. Clayton was there wearing a pressed coat and a false smile. Beside him sat a man with cold eyes and a tin star pinned to his lapel, the bounty hunter. His presence spoke volumes. He wasn't here for justice. He was here for possession. The territorial council sat behind a long table, 5 men, none younger than 50, all with the same gray eyes and harder mouths. The judge banged his gavel. "Proceed." The testimony began. First Clayton, smooth as grease, telling a tale spun from shadows and half-truths. "I never meant to leave the boy. I thought he was dead. I was delirious from the heat. Days later, when I came to, I sent men to search. No sign. I mourned him. I still do." Daniel didn't flinch. Then came the cross-examination. The counsel pressed Clayton on details. Why no obituary? Why no report? Why the sealed land deed transferred the same day he returned? He faltered there, just enough. Then Thorne took the stand. His words were few, but his voice carried. He described finding Daniel, the condition he was in, the recovery, the hospital trip, the doctor's statements. He presented the affidavit. The council reviewed it in silence. Last, Daniel rose slowly with his cane and faced the room. "I was left," he said simply, "and I wasn't found by blood. I was found by a man who didn't know me and chose to stay anyway. That's not charity. That's love. If this room values papers over people, then I know where I don't belong." He sat. No one moved. Then the youngest councilman stood. "We've heard enough." A vote was called. It was unanimous. Full guardianship granted to Thorne. Clayton stood livid. "This isn't justice, that's my son." One of the councilmen turned to him. "No, He's a man now, and you lost the right to call him yours the day you left him for the buzzards." Outside the courthouse, the air felt brighter. Daniel stood taller, and Thorne, for the first time, let himself smile. They didn't throw a celebration. Daniel wouldn't have wanted one, and Thorne had never cared for such things. Instead, they went home quietly, rode out of that town like they'd come into it months before, side by side, but this time with the wind at their backs and nothing chasing them. But something lingered behind, something neither of them spoke of aloud. That look in Clayton Harrow's eyes when the council handed down its decision wasn't grief. It wasn't disappointment. It was rage, slow burning, deep-seated, and cold. The kind of rage that doesn't yell or lash out in the moment but waits, plots, and strikes when you forget it ever existed. Thorne knew that kind of rage. He'd seen it in men who smiled as they passed you in the morning and then sabotaged your water line by sundown. He'd seen it in the eyes of men who thought justice was something they could twist with coin and connections. But he also knew something else. He hadn't survived the mountains for 20 winters to be undone by a man like Clayton Harrow. The weeks that followed were quiet. The cabin took on a rhythm all its own: chickens in the morning, carpentry in the afternoon, and quiet reading or storytelling by lamplight at night. Ruth visited every Sunday, bringing fresh bread and news from town. She never overstayed her welcome, never prodded too much, but her presence lingered long after she left, especially for Daniel. He'd grown used to her voice, the lilt in it, the kindness that wasn't performative, the strength behind her humor. And though he never said it outright, Thorne saw the way his eyes tracked her when she moved about the cabin, the way his voice changed slightly when she spoke his name. Still, Daniel had work to do before he could let himself think of anything so fragile as feelings. His legs weren't fully recovered, though he could now walk half the field and back without help. Thorne had begun constructing a small workshop for him behind the cabin, filled with old tools and wood scraps for him to practice with. They worked on it together in the mornings, not saying much, but understanding everything. Then one morning, just as frost kissed the tips of the grass and the last of summer faded into memory, Thorne went to fetch water from the creek and didn't return. Daniel waited an hour. Then 2. By the 3rd hour, he grabbed his cane and hobbled out the back door, refusing to let fear take the reins. He found Thorne not at the creek, but further down the trail, sitting on a rock, his head in his hands, pale as the morning mist. "Thorne," Daniel's voice trembled more than he wanted it to. The man looked up slowly. There was something in his expression that Daniel had never seen before. Not pain, not anger, not even sadness. It was fear. "Thorne, what is it? Are you hurt?" Thorne swallowed hard. "No, just tired." But Daniel could see the sweat on his brow, the way his shoulders trembled ever so slightly. They walked back together, slower than usual, and by the time they reached the cabin, Thorne looked ready to collapse. Daniel insisted he lie down. He stoked the fire, fetched water, tried to remember everything Ruth had taught him about tending to someone sick. But it wasn't sickness. It wasn't a fever or a cough or even a wound. Thorne was just weak, like something had drained him from the inside out. The next morning, it was worse. He couldn't lift his arms to dress himself. Daniel helped him into his coat and sat him by the fire, panic churning beneath the surface of his every movement. "I'm going to town," Daniel said firmly. "I'll bring Ruth. She'll know what to do." Thorne didn't argue. By the time Daniel reached the edge of town that afternoon, his limp slowing him more than usual, he looked near collapse himself. But Ruth was there, just leaving the chapel with a basket of bread in hand. She saw him, saw the look in his eyes, and dropped the basket without asking a thing. They rode back together in silence. Thorn was asleep when they returned, or so they thought, but when Ruth knelt by his side and placed a hand on his forehead, he opened his eyes slowly. "I knew you'd come," he whispered. Ruth didn't cry, not then. She simply got to work. For 3 days she stayed with them, boiling herbs, feeding Thorn broth, wiping the sweat from his brow, whispering prayers when she thought no one was listening. Daniel didn't leave his side either. He barely slept, barely ate. His legs ached from standing so long, but he refused to sit unless Thorn was resting comfortably. On the 4th night, Thorn finally spoke. "I need to tell you something," he said to Daniel, his voice thin as parchment. Daniel leaned closer. "I knew your mother," Thorn whispered, "long before any of this." Daniel blinked. "What?" "She was a girl when I met her, barefoot, fiery, had a laugh that could stop wolves in their tracks. I worked her father's land for a season. Nothing happened between us, nothing like that. But she told me once if anything ever happened to her to find her boy, to make sure he became a man worth remembering." Daniel's breath caught. "You mean you knew who I was all this time?" Thorn nodded slowly. "Didn't know it at first, not until I saw that scar on your temple. She told me about it once, said you got it trying to climb the barn roof when you were 3. Daniel's hand instinctively touched the old mark. "That's why I couldn't leave you," Thorn said, voice fading. "Not just because you were broken, because you were hers." Tears fell silently down Daniel's cheeks. "I failed her, did I?" "No," Daniel said fiercely. "You saved me. That's more than she could have ever asked for." Thorn smiled faintly. "Then I can rest." "No," Daniel said, gripping his hand. "You don't get to rest yet." But Thorn's eyes had already closed. He wasn't gone, not yet. But something had shifted, something final. That night, as Ruth sat with him and Daniel stood by the window staring into the dark, a gunshot echoed in the trees. Then another. Then silence. Daniel reached for his cane. Ruth stood. "No. I have to see." Ruth hesitated, then grabbed her own rifle from the corner. They stepped out together. 10 feet from the cabin, a body lay in the grass, face down, motionless. Daniel limped forward, Ruth at his side, rifle raised. It was the bounty hunter. Dead. A second body lay just beyond him, one of Clayton's ranch hands. No note, no warning, just 2 men who'd come with ill intent and found their judgment instead. Daniel knelt slowly. They were coming for him. Ruth nodded. "Or for you." They buried the men without ceremony. No headstones, just stones and silence. That night Daniel sat beside Thorn's bed and whispered, "You're not alone, not ever." And for the first time since they met, Thorn whispered back, "I know." But deep in his eyes, Daniel saw something else. Thorn's time was running out. By the end of that week, even Ruth couldn't hide it anymore. Thorn was dying. Not by violence or sickness. Not by anything that had a name the doctor from town could pin to it. No fever claimed him. No wound festered beneath the surface. He simply faded, like a tree long struck by lightning, still standing tall though hollowed out on the inside. He stopped rising with the sun. Then he stopped eating. Then, little by little, his words came less often, each one drawn from a well nearly empty. Daniel never left his side. It was as if the cabin had grown smaller, the air heavier, time slower. Ruth stayed longer now, sleeping in the loft, her presence a quiet assurance in the shadows. Each morning she looked at Thorne, then at Daniel, and said nothing, but her eyes said everything. Daniel spoke to Thorne when he could. Sometimes stories from when he was a boy, memories of his mother he thought he'd forgotten. Other times he simply held Thorne's hand and watched his chest rise and fall, each breath a battle of its own. But what neither of them expected, what came like a gust of wind across dry grass, was that Clayton Harrow hadn't finished what he started. They came before dawn. 5 men on horseback, rifles slung loose and expressions cold as slate. They didn't ride into town. They came through the forest, through the hills, following a trail Daniel had thought only he and Thorne knew. But Clayton had money, and money given long enough buys information. Daniel was gathering water when he heard the first hoofbeat. He turned sharply, cane barely holding his weight, and saw the glint of sun on metal through the trees. They weren't trying to sneak. They were coming to finish something. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He turned, hobbled as fast as his legs would take him back to the cabin, burst through the door. "Ruth," he gasped, "they're coming." She didn't ask who, she didn't ask why. She grabbed her rifle, checked the chamber, then handed Daniel a small revolver. It had only 3 rounds. Daniel stared at it, fingers trembling. "You've got the heart of 10 men," she said softly. "Now show them." He nodded once, then limped to the window, heart thundering. Thorne stirred in bed, eyes open, not quite focused. "Thorne," Daniel whispered, "they're here." The mountain man blinked slowly, as if waking from a dream that had lasted years. His lips moved. Daniel bent close. "Don't let them take you." "I won't." And then the gunfire started. It wasn't chaotic. It was calculated, warning shots into the trees, one against the cabin's corner, splintering the wood like kindling. "Come out," a voice barked. "Clayton, we're not here to bargain. Give me the boy and we walk away." Daniel's knuckles turned white around the grip of the revolver. Ruth looked at him. "You ready?" He nodded. Then the front window exploded. A bullet tore through the frame, missed Daniel by inches, embedded itself in the mantel. Ruth fired back once, twice, then ducked behind the table. Daniel moved to the back of the cabin, checking the kitchen door, still locked, but another shot rang out, this one closer. Then they heard footsteps. On the porch. Daniel turned. No time to think, no time to plan, just act. He raised the revolver, but before he could fire, the door burst open and a man stepped through, rifle raised. A shot rang out. The man dropped. Daniel's ears rang, his hands shook. He'd fired without thinking, instinct overriding every fear he'd ever carried. The man didn't move. But there were still 4 more. Another crashed through the back, tackled Daniel to the floor. The revolver flew from his hand, skidding across the wood. They wrestled, Daniel gasping, elbowing, kicking. His legs useless, but his arms fueled by something rower than strength. Ruth shouted, another shot, a scream. The man on Daniel pinned his chest with one arm, reached for a knife with the other. Daniel grabbed the cast-iron kettle from the hearth and swung. It cracked against the man's skull with a sickening thud. He slumped. Daniel rolled him off, gasping for breath, then crawled to the revolver, grabbed it, and saw Clayton step through the doorway. His coat was clean, his eyes were calm. and the pistol in his hand pointed straight at Daniel. "You're not worth all this," Clayton said quietly, "but you've become a problem. Problems have a way of becoming examples." Daniel didn't speak. Behind Clayton, Ruth lay bleeding her shoulder. She wasn't dead, but she was down. Daniel tried to lift the revolver. Clayton fired. The bullet caught Daniel in the side, tore through flesh like paper. He screamed, fell back, gasping, pain blinding everything else. Clayton stepped closer. "You could have stayed in that desert," he said. "Could have done the one decent thing and died where you were left, but you had to crawl back." Daniel tried to raise the gun again. "Couldn't." Clayton raised his. Then from the bed, a voice. "Hey." Clayton turned. Thorne stood. He wasn't holding a weapon. Just standing, somehow tall, gaunt, his eyes burning like embers. "I told you," he rasped, "you'll never touch him again." Clayton smiled almost pitifully. "You can't stop me." "No," Thorne said. "But he can." He stepped forward. Clayton fired. Thorne didn't stop. Another shot. Thorne stumbled. Blood bloomed across his chest, but he kept walking. Clayton backed up, eyes wide now. What are you?" Thorne's hand shot out, grabbed the barrel of the gun, shoved it aside. Then he grabbed Clayton by the collar and slammed him against the wall. "You made him crawl," Thorne whispered. "Now you crawl." He threw Clayton to the floor. The rancher scrambled, coughing, reaching for his pistol, but Ruth kicked it away, even wounded. Daniel, bleeding, crawled toward them, dragging his leg. Thorne swayed. "Daniel," he whispered. The boy looked up. Thorne smiled. "I kept my promise." Then he fell. Not like a man shot. Like a tree cut from its roots. Daniel screamed. Ruth reached him first, pressing cloth to his side, tears on her cheeks. "Stay with me," she begged. "Daniel, please." But Daniel crawled to Thorne. The mountain man wasn't breathing. He was still, eyes closed, a faint smile on his lips. Daniel clutched his hand. "I'm here," he whispered. "I'm here." No answer. Clayton groaned on the floor, tried to rise. Daniel stood. Bleeding, barely standing, but standing. He limped toward Clayton, gun in hand. Clayton flinched. "You're not going to kill me," he spat. "No," Daniel said. "I'm going to let the town see what you really are." Clayton tried to speak. Daniel raised the revolver. Crack. Not at Clayton, just above his head. The rancher flinched again. "Run," Daniel whispered. Clayton didn't argue. He scrambled to his feet and ran into the woods like a dog beaten too many times. Ruth reached Daniel, helped him down, pressed cloth harder against the wound. "You saved us," she whispered. "No," he rasped, eyes on Thorne. "He did." Outside, the sun broke through the clouds. For the first time in weeks, the light felt warm. Daniel reached into his coat, pulled out the drawing, held it high. Maybe not in court, but this man Thorne, he didn't need a trial to know what justice was. He lived it. He died for it. Then he stepped down and walked straight toward Clayton. The rancher didn't move. Daniel stopped a foot away. "Do you deny it?" Clayton's jaw flexed. "You're nothing." Daniel nodded. "Maybe, but I still walk straighter than you." Clayton lunged, but the sheriff caught him. Two deputies stepped forward. The room erupted not in chaos but in movement. People shouted. Some jeered, some cried. Clayton was dragged out. He didn't look back. Daniel stood alone, breathing hard, legs trembling. The townsfolk parted around him. And for the first time, nobody looked away. 3 days later, Daniel stood by the churchyard with Ruth. A small plaque had been placed beneath a new tree. It read, "Thorn, he was enough." A boy approached, 8 maybe 9, dirty face, thin arms, orphan by the look of him. "Mister," the boy asked, "you really live up on that mountain?" Daniel nodded. The boy paused. "You take kids?" Daniel blinked. Ruth watched him carefully. "I didn't," Daniel said slowly, "but maybe I should start." The boy grinned. Daniel reached down, tousled his hair. Then he looked at Ruth. "I'm not done," he said. "No," she smiled, "you've just started." And as the sun dipped low and the wind blew down from the ridges, Daniel felt it again, that warmth, that pull. He turned toward the hills, toward home, toward a future Thorn had died to give him. And he walked forward, leaving behind the pain, carrying only what mattered. Love, truth, and the strength to keep going.